the main questions behind this line of research concern the ability of people to escape their position of birth. I think in sociology it's called origin and destination. In economics we're much more crude and we just say your birth conditions. And when it comes to measuring, the question we ask ourselves is, do poor children become poor adults themselves? And do rich children become rich adults? And if the answer is yes, which is yes in almost any society on which we have data, although to different degrees, I'll show you some graphs on that. If it is true that being born rich is an advantage that you get in your life, what is it about being born rich that makes you rich? And if that's the case, what can policymakers do to break that cycle? Are there things that you don't want to break? Like, for instance, a parent transmitting some good habits of studying or passion for knowledge, those things you don't want to break, but you want to help those who don't have that transmission to have some substitute for that or some other type of intervention. Now, the way the economics literature goes about this, the very first step, which is what I'm going to focus today, is to find some number that gives you an idea of how much of your parental status is transmitted to the next generation. Then on the basis of this number, we're going to rank countries. And we're going to see how this intergenerational mobility relates to cross-sectional inequality. And then I'll suggest, on the basis of the literature, some of the drivers of mobility and what the government can do to intervene and create opportunities for those who are not born rich. Okay, Fasila gave me one equation, and so I'm going to present the equation right now. But it's a very simple equation, just one variable. And the variable is income of the child, and this is income of the parent. And what this equation is saying is, what is this beta coefficient here, what is the effect that the income of the association, actually, I should say, the association between the income of the parent with the income of the child, right? And this beta is called intergenerational elasticity. Elasticity means how much my income reacts to the income of my father in a statistical way. It's not necessarily a causal relationship. It's an overall measure. You can imagine two extremes. 0 means that my income is independent of my father's income. 1 is the opposite. My income is fully determined by my parents' income. So you can imagine these two extremes, just like the Gini coefficient between 0 and 1, but the Gini coefficient is by construction between 0 and 1. This is empirically between 0 and 1. In reality, one could find anything, but for most countries, we find a value between 0 and 1. So the higher the value, the less mobility, the more persistence. I'll give you an example of what that means. So for instance, this is from a paper by Miles Korak. For example, in the US, children in the top quintile are 12 times richer than people at the bottom. So if your elasticity is 1, so fully complete immobility, after one generation you have exactly the same ratio between rich and poor. As the elasticity goes down, less of that advantage is transmitted across generations. So for instance, for an elasticity of 0.2, you would have that advantage decreases quite a bit. For higher elasticity, you still have quite a bit of advantage after one generation. And you can put this dynamically, and you see that depending on the elasticity value, it takes more generations for that advantage to dissipate. So when people say, well, but you're talking about things that happened 50 years ago, now we're all equal. Well, it's not true. It takes a lot of generations for inequality to converge to equality, if it does. So it's a number that tells us the degree to which economic status persists across generation. And it's a number that is related to inequality because, by construction, if dynasties can keep their position in society, then that will make itself a more unequal society in the long run. I'm going to start with evidence from high-income countries, and then we'll move to emerging economies. So you see there is quite a bit of variation in this beta value across countries. The usual suspects are at the bottom, the Nordic European countries, Canada, and other countries are at the top of this ranking of high-income countries. The United States especially has received a lot of attention in this literature, largely because the perception of mobility was quite high among Americans. If you asked Americans whether everyone can become rich and we all have the same opportunities and through hard work you can get to the top, the so-called American dream. And well, the data show us that it is a dream, meaning that it's not something that is realistic. It's something that only a few people can achieve. And now, finally, I think Americans are accepting that. So the perception, as it was said before, is as important as reality. So there is quite a bit of variation, as I showed with the little table before. The lower the value, the easier it is for somebody to not be confined in the same income status, in the same income class as their parents. The higher the value, the harder it is for them to escape that position. And this is true for both rich and poor people. So it's funny because when we talk about mobility, we always think about escaping from poverty. But the truth is that high mobility also means that rich people born rich can become poor. And in fact, it's probably for a given level of growth, or it's something probably to expect. Somebody's going to have to take those places at the top. And if I'm taking a place at the top, and the quintile is defined as fixed, somebody is getting out of the top, right? So mobility goes both ways. Relative mobility. Then absolute mobility is something else. This is, again, for the rich countries, the relationship between the Gini coefficient, which is a very common measure of inequality, and that elasticity that I defined earlier. This shows that countries with higher cross-sectional inequality, as measured by the Gini coefficient, also have higher persistence, so have less mobility. This has been called the Great Gatsby Curve by Alan Kruger, who was one of the counselor of Obama, the economic council of Obama. Now, so this is what the literature does. This is what the crucial number we're looking at is. What about South Africa? South Africa, first of all, is a very interesting case because on that graph, we are somewhere around here, so it's a very interesting case to add to that graph. But also because when you look at education instead of income, in fact, South Africa is not particularly immobile. And part of the reason is that we have very high enrollment, and when you simply take the correlation between the education of children and their parents, you're not controlling for quality. So if we have high enrollment and everybody more or less gets to at least 9-10 years of education, which you have to by law, then you will get the impression that there is mobility if you only look at years of schooling. Of course, if you start controlling for the quality of the schooling and how much you're learning, then you will probably get a different picture, but it's hard to measure quality. So by looking at income, we have a metric that is easier to relate to your welfare. And the other reason why South Africa is an interesting place for social scientists, not so much if you're born poor, is that here there is, so I show you those graphs, it takes generations for inequality to go away if there is a process of convergence. Well, here you have only one generation ago, not even, you have a system that was explicitly designed for that beta to be 1, at least by group, okay? So if you have a system that was designed on a table, how can we keep that beta to 1? Then it's interesting to see how much have we gone down from that design. So far so good. The problem is you need very good data to do this. Why? Because if you imagine what you need to follow one generation, record their incomes, then you need to link them to their kids, wait until they grow up, follow their incomes, and then correlate the two. Unfortunately, we cannot do that yet in South Africa. NIDS hopefully will keep running for 100 years and we will be able to do it, but for now we can't. So we need to resort to some other type of estimation. And the way that the literature does it is by using two samples from two different surveys. They happen to be both SALDRU driven surveys. The first is the PSLSD in 93, also known as the SALDRU survey, as Mari said, in which we get a snapshot of the income of some pseudo parents. They're not the actual parents of the younger people we see today. And then we go to the NIDS and we see the current generation, we see their incomes. And how do we link them? We link them because the NIDS has a question on parents. In the adult questionnaire, you ask a few questions about your parents. The two questions that help us are parental education and parental occupation. So on the basis of these responses that people give about their parents, we then go back to the 93 survey and estimate what people with those characteristics were earning in 93. So in a sense, we are imputing parental income on the basis of what the children are recollecting today. So if I say that my father had a matric and he was a clerk in a bank, then I go back to the SALDRU survey of 93, see what clerks with matric were earning, and I impute that income to my father. Okay? And then I correlate the two. So by doing this, we can get a number for South Africa. A number of other researchers in other countries have done the same. So that initial graph that I showed you, we can now expand it to include a bunch of emerging economies. And this is what happens. So the usual suspects are still up there, the Denmarks and the Swedens of the world. And then as you go down, you get to more emerging economies. And unfortunately, South Africa, together with Brazil and other Latin American countries, is up there in terms of persistence. Here, I'm actually using the paper, not from the number, not from my paper, but from the paper by Mari, Vimal, and Arden, I think. Because it's newer, they have better data. So this shows that this beta that I showed you is very high in South Africa. Now, consider then here, the rich people make more than 12 times what the poor people make. If you look at that table I showed you at the beginning, this means they would take T greater than 10 generations for this inequality to go away. So we're looking at hundreds of years. So this is a number that must go down if we want real mobility. Now, of course, the number itself, one has to be careful because there's always a statistical error. So, you know, you could go down up to 50 or up to 80. There's standard errors, they're called. But the point is, even when you account for this statistical error, it is clear that this group of countries here is very different than this group of countries there. Okay? Now, if you add this to the fact that cross-sectionally we are also fairly unequal, then, cross-sectionally also is unequal, then this means that we need to do something to sort of break this cycle. Now, the beta is just one number and doesn't tell us what happens across the distribution. Now, Mari showed us a graph that tells us what happens across the distribution and tells us that if you're born at the bottom, you're very likely to stay there. Okay? The other relevant dimension in South Africa, of course, is race. And by decomposing this beta, this is from my paper instead, by decomposing this beta, we see that we can, without going into detail, but we can essentially see how much each group contributes to this beta. And what I find is that in the sample that I was using, only 10% of the sample were white South Africans. However, they contributed to 40% of the intergenerational transmission. Now, this is very interesting because in the US, we have a similar result for African Americans. They were a smaller proportion, they call them minority, a minority of the population in the US, but they contribute to a lot of the intergenerational persistence. So when you have a group that is persistently confined in one side of the distribution, that spikes up your intergenerational immobility. Of course, the difference here is that in the American case, that minority group is at the bottom of the distribution and consistently confined there. And here, the minority group is at the top of the distribution and persistently there. So this is an interesting result because it shows that group mobility, or group persistence in this case, contributes to bring up this number. And in fact, you have countries where Brazil, where you also have substantial heterogeneity. You have the US, which by high income countries is fairly high persistence. You have Peru, though you also have minorities in terms of indigenous people. So you see that group differences are very important. So that tells us an obvious culprit of low mobility in South Africa, which is limited, although it's not zero because there is some mobility, but limited changes in the structure of our inequality as it comes to race. Now, when we add that graph that I showed you before and we add all these other countries, the relationship between cross-sectional inequality and intergenerational mobility is still there. So higher inequality is generally associated to lower mobility. And now with all these new countries, it becomes clear that the relationship is still there. In fact, the World Bank is preparing a report on this. And so it's going to have even more countries. Now, this is what the situation is. Now I'm going to do the last part of my presentation is more speculative, well, informed by the literature, but more speculative on what we can do about it. So there's a number of reasons why we would expect inequality to be related to mobility. And this can work through several channels. Obviously, sort of first order channel is redistribution itself, how much we take from the rich and give to the poor. But then is the labor market. Mari showed us that a substantial portion of inequality comes from labor market earnings. So the labor market is an obvious place where to look for solutions. Then of course we have welfare system, segregation, geographic segregation, especially in South Africa. And then I'll give an assist to the presentations later on behavioral mechanisms as well. So, redistribution. Fiscal policies is probably the number one tool that governments have to reduce inequality. That same tool can also be used to reduce persistence, or to increase mobility. Now, what is the problem here? And we see that in political economy model as well as in elections outcomes. The problem is that if you think that you're rich because you work hard and you deserve it, you will oppose redistribution. If you think that you're poor because you deserve it, you will also oppose redistribution. And the problem is that we're humans and we tend to convince ourselves of things that don't make us feel bad. So if you're very rich, it's very hard to tell yourself that you're rich because you're lucky. You want to believe that you're very good. And a version of this is cognitive dissonance, but I'm not a psychologist. But the point is that you try to convince yourself of things that don't make you feel bad. And so it's very hard to convince rich people to redistribute because they work hard, they work 14 hours a day, and they think they deserve every penny of it. So one of the reasons why this literature is important is because if we can show that at least some portion of our privilege is inherited from the past, whether it's an explicit past like South Africa or other type of past in other countries, then that could help redistributive platforms for governments. So by informing people of the origin of inequality, rather than just the number, hopefully that can change public opinion towards redistribution. Unfortunately, the world seems to be going in the other direction, but this is one thing we can do. And this is where perceptions come in. so the perceived level of mobility is actually more important than the actual. So there's this nice paper by Alesina and others on comparing different countries in the world. And it's not the actual level of mobility that is correlated to preferences for redistribution, it's what people think mobility is. And then again, you have Americans who think that mobility is on average higher, which means that they have less of a demand for redistribution. So I don't know what the policy implication is for this. I don't know, give leaflets to people of real mobility, I'm not sure. But I guess what I'm trying, the take-out message from this is perceptions are as important as information, and information could help shape redistribution. As I said, the second big arena where one could intervene is the labor market. The obvious reason is what Mario was saying, that the labor market is one of the main players in determining the distribution of income, of course. And if the labor market rewards advantages rather than skills, then you have a problem. And you have a problem not just because it's unfair, it's also inefficient, right? So if you wouldn't want a doctor to be there just because his father was a doctor. You would like there to have a doctor that is there because he's good. So Plato has actually something about this, how you want to give positions of power to good people, not to people who are connected and have the right network. So it's not just unfair, it's also inefficient. And if one assumes, as one should, that ability is sort of randomly distributed at birth, then by always giving positions of power to a certain section of the population, we're actually losing talent. So it's inefficient, right? One example is parental networks. 68% of jobs in South Africa are found through informal networks. So the vast majority of jobs are found through, hey, you know, there's a job there, why don't you come? If you look at UCT, I was actually looking at some stats, especially more so in the pass category than academic, but there is a substantial number of people with the same surname. Maybe they're not related, but you know. Although some people look very much alike. So, and maybe there's nothing wrong with it. Maybe there is this intergenerational transmission of being a good UCT employee, but you know. The second example is discrimination. The labor market, there is widespread evidence all around the world that hiring managers discriminate on the basis of observable characteristics that are not related to productivity. So gender, race, sexual orientation, or things like that. So these are characteristics that are not related to productivity, but are used by employer to determine whether I'm offering you a job or not. So both these examples give an idea of places where you can intervene. So for instance, together with J. Paolo, we're looking at ways to reduce these information asymmetries, ways for people to find job, people who are not connected, people who don't have that help from the parent. I know a guy who can give you a job. Now, we shouldn't wait until people enter the labor market to do something about their opportunities. The literature in economics, but probably even more so in other disciplines, tell us that early childhood is especially important. And the reason for this, according to Heckman and a bunch of his co-authors, is that skill formation is a dynamic process, and what you do very early on increases the return to what you do later. So if your mother eats well when you're still in the womb, and then has no alcohol or whatever, and that is going to increase the return to reading to your child when he's 0 to 1. And if you read to your child when he's 0 to 1, that is going to increase the return of a good preschool, and so on. So they are cumulative. So by intervening early on, Heckman says, we're actually getting the greatest return to our investment. Because not only we're increasing that particular input, we're also increasing the return to whatever input we throw at them later on in life. Okay? So Heckman has this graph of the returns to investment, public policy investment, essentially. And this can happen in many different ways. Through maternal health investment, through preschool programs, immunization, sanitation, nutrition. And basic education versus higher education. So this could also, I don't want to talk too much about this, but this also informs a little bit the debate we're having right now in this country about higher education versus basic education, right? If we believe Heckman, perhaps for a given rent that the government has, the decision between basic and higher education, maybe this calculation should be taken into account. Where do we get the highest return? Also because by creating a citizenship that has at least a level of human capital through the basic compulsory schooling, that has all sorts of knock-on effect on a number of other things: health, crime, civic engagement, and things like that. So there are a number of investments we can make at the early childhood or early primary year schooling levels. Of course, this, I don't want to go into political economy and politics, but of course this comes with other issues of resistance from certain groups, but this is certainly an obvious candidate for intervention. Another thing that South Africa could use is some intervention that take into specific account the geography of inequality. So there's a nice work done by Chetty and others in the US where they have a map of the country and they show you which areas are mobile and which areas are less mobile. We don't have that yet in South Africa. Hopefully one day, again, either with the NIDS or with some other data set, we may be able to have a map ourselves. But at the moment, we don't have the data for that. But clearly, in a situation like South Africa, where the geography of the country, especially when it comes to, for instance, the location of jobs versus where people live, that can play a role in terms of intervention. And again, there are projects underway at SALDRU that speak to that. So perhaps how to increase the access to jobs. Not only in terms of geographical distance, but also in terms of community role models. So again, in the US, there is a large literature on peer effects and role models and how people tend to create these ideas of what being successful mean on a local level. And here, something similar could be happening, where you create your own version of what it means to be successful based on some type of local hierarchy, which could be at the level of the township, could be at some other level, and then doesn't necessarily lead you to behaviors that are consistent with you being lifted out of poverty. For instance, if I think that my best shot to be lifted out of poverty is to win a reality context on TV, then I may invest less in education. But if those are the people who look successful in my community, then I may try to do that. Or if I think that being successful, as it happens in many situations in South Africa and abroad, means having a lot of money because I'm a drug dealer or something like that, then I will try to invest in that, because we're humans, we respond to incentives. So by breaking these norms, in a sense, we may be able also to have an effect on mobility. And this is just like what I was saying before about the interaction between different inputs. The social norms of a given place also interact with the public investment. So if I build a fantastic new school with state-of-the-art technology, but the social norm is that I should become a singer, then the state-of-the-art technology may not be helpful to many people, right? So social norms and public policy interact. Finally, one of the channels that are relevant for increasing mobility, which is related to social norms, is the discussion around aspirations. I think Malcolm is going to talk a little bit about that later. But there is again widespread evidence around the world that your parental background is highly correlated to the aspirations you have. I remember as a child speaking to different people from different socioeconomic backgrounds, and in my own little survey as a child, I could see that. So the child of the doctor would more likely to say they want to become a doctor. The child of the truck driver more likely say they want to become some type of blue-collar worker. So and aspirations are very important because, again, they determine the motivation towards certain type of activities as a child. But aspirations alone is not enough. We could successfully, I don't know how, maybe through some type of public campaign, raise aspirations of people, but if there is not a psychological intervention that comes with it, you could try to change my aspirations, but if my experience consistently tells me that there is no way I'm getting out of this, if my experience consistently tells me everyone I know is either in jail or unemployed, then I could have all the aspirations of the world, but it takes a lot of self-motivation to get out of that. So obviously, again, that's another reason why inequality in itself creates persistence, because if inequality is perceived as inevitable, then again, I don't have a reason to even put effort, which reinforces the stereotype, oh, the poor are poor because they're lazy. But it's not that. Helplessness and hopelessness are acquired trait. We're not born helpless. We acquire helplessness. So those are interventions. I'm actually surprised there is no more of this in South Africa. There is no more, maybe there is and I'm not aware of. Actually, I should qualify my statement. More psychological interventions at the level of poor communities. So this is a spot for creating more psychologists in South Africa. Finally, in the sort of behavioral side of things, there's also a problem of trust. Again, if my experience consistently tells me there are a certain group of people, which in South Africa tends to be highly correlated also with race, but it doesn't have to be, it could be just social class. But if my experience tells me that a certain group of people consistently maintains their status, and my group of people is essentially blocked to reach that status, then that creates a lack of trust. A lack of trust has problems on stability, crime, political violence, and things like that. So there are a number of dimensions over which, I guess this last point is to say that reducing immobility, so creating opportunities, it's a very selfish policy. We're not doing it because we're good human beings. We should be doing it to protect the social pact. If there is any, I don't know. All right, so to conclude, you know, by the way, the children born every day in South Africa have very different life prospects. So there's about 3,000 children per day, I think. About 2,000 of these children that are born today, we can predict statistically that they will be poor. And they're just born. They haven't done anything. So equality of life chances is a very strong concept everyone can relate to. So it's a powerful leverage for policy. And why is that? Because we relate it to the notion of fairness. And when we think of fairness, the literature, borderline philosophy and economics tell us that there are two principles we can use to think of fairness in a concrete way. One is the principle of compensation. If inequality is due to things that are beyond my control, for instance, I was born in this community, I was born from these parents, then that inequality should be compensated, which is the whole notion of privilege and lack of privilege. The principle of reward that you want to keep some level of inequality, economists say, because that will incentivize effort and will create good work ethic and things like that. But that inequality should derive from things over which people have control. Now, the circumstances and the effort interact, so it's not a clear-cut definition, but the point is that one can essentially divide up inequality by the type, by the origin of it. And the intergenerational mobility literature does just that by taking one dimension, which is your parental economic status. Obviously, we don't choose our parents' economic status, so we shouldn't be held responsible for the family we were born in. And the government should do something to compensate those of us who are born in families that were not able to provide us with all those factors that lead us to have economic success. I think that's my presentation.